Today we're going to talk about the incredibly over-described U.S. Civil War, but perhaps I'm going to take it from a slightly different direction because we're talking about in terms of great man theory, elite theory, people's theory, etc., trying to get a feel for what are the root causes. So the American Civil War lead up is probably one of the best illustrations of elite history in action. Originally, the establishment agreed, and I mean by originally from the very beginning of the country, they believed that slavery wasn't an issue that needed to be solved in an expedient manner. The goal of maintaining the Union was the greater good. Even the elites that were against slavery were, for the most part, willing to let this play out over decades. Compromise is how stable establishments function. The American establishment did so, even on this thorny question. The Jacksonian Revolution was a process of realigning the elite. Jackson created an elite consensus by simultaneously taking the establishment figures who were on the outside and forging them into the old center, and disenfranchising the groups that had been part of the power structure for decades. The disenfranchised are always still there in the establishment, they're just at the margins. Jackson's establishment would not alter the equation on slavery. Compromise would still be the way forward. At the point Jackson became president, the U.S. was effectively a monoparty for 3 election cycles. Jackson's revolution pushed the elites to the margin who did not appreciate being in that position. These people would inspire the formation of the Whig Party, the American Whig Party to be precise. The Whigs were an elitist, anti populist element of the establishment. Their agenda was more of a list of wants than a specific philosophy, or not even really principles, but they would describe them as such. The party struggled its entire existence. Yeah, they had instances of their candidate winning the presidency, and then their presidential candidate would often ignore their wish list, and some presidents outright balked at implementing any of their agenda. Even with a new faction within the establishment, the question of slavery was solved by establishment compromise. Now, several things would go along to upset the old compromise on slavery. First, the addition of territories upset the balance of power. Every time a new state would come in, there would be a back and forth trying to make sure that at least the Senate stayed balanced between slave and free states. This became more and more difficult to do because as you went further west, there was less of a need for slaves because the land didn't support the kind of uh, plantation work that was being done by them. Second, an influx of primarily German revolutionaries from the 1848 revolutions would create anti slavery factions that were much bigger than previously existed. These newcomers would then become prime potentials for political assimilation. A portion of the elites that backed the Whigs eventually got tired of being out of power. Yeah, they had a few moments, but they were always kind of what I would call the half party. When we talk about a two-party system, the Democrats and the Whigs were really a party and a half system. Some of these Whigs wanted to alter the old compromise on slavery. This environment eventually caused the Whig Party to fracture. One of the fragments would use populist elements of anti slavery to create a viable coalition, which would eventually become known as the Republican Party. The overall sentiment of this group was for a new compromise on slavery, one where slavery wasn't allowed to expand, and that it was understood over the long term slavery would probably die of natural causes. The new Republican Party championed nearly all the anti-Jacksonian causes of the Whig Party, ones that it formed for in the first place. This shattered consensus within the United States would end up leading to a GOP victory. Now, mind you, it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't want to get into that election. That's a whole new another video. Now, the sad thing about the Republicans as a party is they probably were not as radical as many in the South believed. Now, there were absolutely very radical and scary elements within the Republican Party, but they were the minority. However, a combination of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and northern newspapers convinced the South that the GOP was essentially all lunatic abolitionists. John Brown's raid and subsequent newspaper lionizations convinced the South that the North favored abolition, even via slave insurrection. And slave insurrections in the South tended to be very bloody affairs with entire families being wiped out. Now, the decision to begin secession was not a people's movement, but an elite movement. Essentially, it was decided at the state house level when when secession would start to occur. And on the other side of it, in terms of great man, no one man rose above another as a driver. You can pick out key players in the secession movement, but you can't pick a single driver where you say because of this one man, everyone rallied to secession. Now, mind you, there may have been a tipping point, but in terms of great, well-known Americans, they don't exist in this crowd. So the war itself was really kind of a tragedy of errors. Lincoln grossly misread Fort Sumter. He was given the option of taking one fort versus another one off the coast of Florida, which probably would have caused a lot less trouble than going after Fort Sumter. He clearly underestimated the reaction that he would get, and there was a lot of misunderstanding about what he promised to do in terms of Fort Sumter and what actually happened. Nonetheless, this would end up causing Virginia to secede. Well, once he was in a position where essentially Washington, D.C. was on the verge of being surrounded by secessionist states, he called up the militia. This ended up making things far worse in terms of secession. Whether it was actually needed for the security of the capital or not is another question. And in terms of the war, Lincoln really was at best an armchair general. His job was to pick a general, fire them when they failed, and replace them until he finally found good generals. There were probably a dozen men who could have done the same job Lincoln did. Now, if you look at essentially comparing the North to the South, the North's total superiority in population, manufacturing, and general wealth pretty much meant the outcome in terms of a contest was inevitable. The only thing that wasn't inevitable was the timing. In order to make the outcome occur, that was going to occur anyway, required someone with the resolve to see it to the end. Again, there were probably a dozen people who could have done this. And in all honesty, the South's only real path to victory was the North tiring of the war and quitting. We do have a little bit of people's theory in play here. The new territories do alter the politics of the people, as well as the immigrant Germans who came in the first place. However, this in itself would do little unless the elite decide they want to exploit it. And when they saw this new population group, they decided that they would exploit it in fact. So therefore, we have the Republican Party coming out of this. Secession itself clearly is an elite act. It was the group of the people who were in charge, the establishment who made these decisions. It was not popular demand by the people. It was certainly not a People's Revolution. And Lincoln himself, and I know this is going to bother a lot of people, can hardly be considered a great man. He was the man in position at the time. And it's not that he was an irreplaceable man. His bad choices for general likely made the war go on longer than it needed to. It's not like Lincoln rode the horse of history to a destination. He sat atop a bucking horse that was bound to stop sometime. Again, a feat many people could have done just as easily. So the question is there a great man here? Well, maybe. It might be John Brown. He caused a tipping point. No one commanded him to go. He convinced the elites of Boston to fund his endeavors without ever telling him what his plan was. He ultimately got what he wanted. He was the major cause of it. Now, mind you, it didn't happen exactly the way he planned it. I'm not sure if I like this idea as John Brown as a great man of history. So, comments below. In terms of looking at this as elite history, great man history, or people's history, does John Brown rise to the stature of great man here? And it's not a matter of liking or disliking him, it's a matter of would this have occurred without him? Is he the one who stepped into a gap and fulfilled something that would have just come sloshing along on its own for a long time without him? Don't know. But I'd be curious to see what you think. Please smash the like button. Check out my other titles. I get into a lot of different things, politics, history, economics. If when you see my titles, you'll need to subscribe because then you'll get this content as it comes out. And also, if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.